So attempting to deal with 1984 is kind of tricky because there's so much you can say about it. There's so many angles about it. Because fundamentally, what it is there's a concept called the novel of ideas, which is something like Dune or this, where the focus isn't so much the plot per se, but exploring different interesting concepts, different ideas of the author is trying to get across. And I think that that's important to keep in mind when you're reading something like this. Because in a novel of ideas, because the author's trying to make a point, they'll often resort to they'll often resort to polemic and to exaggeration to get their point across. And that happens very frequently in 1984, as we'll get into in a minute. But I think it's important when you're reading this book and you're like, that doesn't seem like that makes sense, or that seems like kind of an exaggeration. That's true. Like when we talk about we've always been at war with East Asia, that's he's Orwell, I don't think, in my opinion at least, is literally saying that's how dumb people are. That they can go from we've always been at war with East Asia to we've always been at war with Eurasia, and people will just spin on a dime. I don't think that's what he's trying to say. He's using it as kind of an extreme example for the gradual changing of history over a period of time. So I guess kind of an example of that, and I guess we'll dive right into this. An example of that would be how movies used to be more historically accurate in how they depicted demography. People, if you were looking at a movie about medieval Europe, everybody in the movie would be white or European. If you look at a movie that takes place in China, in medieval China, everyone would be Chinese. In Africa, they would be black, except if there's white people there, because they'd normally be the characters because it was made for a European audience. But I digress. But what they started to do was they started to come up with clever ways of inserting diversity. Like, oh, they're a Moorish slave. Oh, they were brought over by the Romans. Yeah, that's why. So they just started coming up with lame reasons to insert diversity into the movies. And they inserted more and more of it. And now what we have is, in a lot of movies about the medieval era, just like 50% of the cast will be black. And there'll be no explanation for this. It's just there. And because they've kind of done it over time, the idea is that they've actively changed the past. And I guess what Orwell's saying is before you know it, it does get to the point where we were always at war with Eurasia. Now, another thing that I think that particular part's a reference to, and if you read, how do you pronounce his name? Kussler? Arthur Kussler's book, Darkness at Noon, they talk about the sense of alienation that a lot of worldwide communists felt. Because what had happened was communism and fascism saw each other as the ultimate opponent, that there had to be a dialectical war between the two. Only one revolutionary ideology could win, and they would rule the world. What wound up happening, though, is for pragmatic reasons, you had the Molotov von Ribbentrop non-aggression pact, where the Soviet Union and Germany basically became allies and annexed Poland together. So when that happened, the Soviet Union told all the communist parties around the world, okay, you have to support Nazi Germany now. Stop advocating against fascism. The fascists are our allies. So you had a case where all these communist parties who had fought fascists in the streets were now being told by the Soviet Union, we've always been supporters of the fascists. And then when Operation Barbarossa happened, it went back again, and then the fascists were the Nazi swine or the serpents or whatever. So the point being, it's a lot of things in Orwell's book are exaggerated versions of things in real life. Like the whole bread and circuses thing is obviously he's taken it to an absurd degree in a lot of respects, but that's kind of the point. So if you're ever reading the book and you're like, this sounds implausible, just try to maybe dial it back a bit. Say, okay, he's referring to general changes over time Doublethink is also, once again, an exaggeration. The government can't just come up with a completely new language and impose it on people. It's just not going to work. I mean, historically, you've had stuff like that, but what normally winds up happening in that case is you have a country like France or Spain or something with a bunch of regional dialects, and the central government gets a group of scholars or professors or whatever, and they establish like standard French or standard Hindi or standard English or something that kind of provides a variant of the language that everyone in the country can use. That's not really doublethink, though. That's just for convenience sake. But I can't really think of an example of a government just implementing a completely new language on the public without some sort of historical precedent or, like I said, for some sort of pragmatic reason for that. However, if we look at our current state of affairs, you have cases like where the word gay has been taken from what it used to mean, which was kind of happy and cheerful, to meaning two men having sex now. So that is kind of an example of doublethink, is taking, or like the term social justice is another one, because social justice used to be a Catholic concept, but it now just become a left-wing concept that applies to all sorts of situations that the original users of the term would have no real time for. Multiculturalism is another one, because multiculturalism isn't even really multiculturalism. It's blending a bunch of different cultures together into a monoculture. Now, the monoculture is a chimera. It's a syncretic culture, but ultimately multiculturalism does lead to some sort of singular cultural construct. So that's just a couple examples of what I think are some cases where Orwell is taking kind of a real world phenomenon and just exaggerating it. So that being said, let's get into Ing-Soc, because that's what this video is really about. Like I said, I'm just going to kind of be rambling about a bunch of different things because this book is so huge. I just have a couple different topics I wanted to touch on. So Ing-Soc, or English socialism, is the official ideology of the United Oceanic States. Oceania is roughly described as being the Anglosphere countries and the rest of the Americas with parts of South Africa. So you have them, then you have Eurasia, which is basically Eurasia. It's Russia and Europe. And then you have East Asia, which is, well, East Asia. And you have these three superpowers that are locked in eternal struggle with one another. Now, the backstory isn't very clear. And the other thing when you're dealing with 1984 is no one's a reliable narrator. Everybody is, by and large, lying. But as best as we can determine, sometime in the 1950s, there was a global nuclear war. And kind of out of the chaos of that arose the three superstates, with Oceania and Eurasia emerging first, assumably Eurasia being the first one, and the East Asia emerging somewhat later. So during the chaos, revolutions brought different parties to power in the three countries. In Oceania, we have Ing-Soc, or English socialism. In Eurasia, we have neo-Bolshevism. And in East Asia, we have what probably sounds like the most interesting one, but isn't explored, obliteration of the self, or death worship, which I'm assuming is some sort of totalitarian version of Buddhism, just from the way it sounds. So what is English socialism? English socialism, as it's defined in the book, is the idea that power doesn't serve any purpose other than power. Because traditionally speaking, and they refer to the Nazis and the communists as being close to understanding the truth about history, but ultimately both groups made the mistake of actually caring about something. Both groups believed that ultimately their totalitarian ideologies served an end goal. In the terms of Germany, it was to build the Thousand-Year Reich. It was built to build the German Empire. Everyone would be equal in the German Empire who wasn't killed for being impure. They would create this immensely wealthy, egalitarian, pure state from which all the people would prosper. And the Soviet Union had the idea that one day the world would all be under communism and there'd be no more war, and you'd have a collective regime of peace and love. So theoretically, and I think this is something important to keep in mind when you're talking about communism, the original idea in communism is that you're supposed to go from capitalism to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then eventually, as the proletariat dictatorship makes society equal, the state is supposed to fade away, and you just have a communist world without the need for secret police or totalitarianism or forced redistribution of wealth. Once you've ended the cycle of capitalism, the communist state is just supposed to be self-sustaining. So that's just something to keep in mind. So the Ing-Soc issue with that is power serves no purpose other than power. The ideology of the party is just totalitarianism. It's totalitarianism for totalitarianism's sake. It's a belief that that's just an inherent good, that it doesn't really need any other purpose than control for control's sake. And this is kind of hard to understand because most people listening to this have at least some sense of morality or some value in something. So the concept of complete nihilism as being your philosophy is difficult to grasp. Now, I think to understand this, we have to understand that Orwell, I think, very accurately predicted what today we know as postmodernism. Now, postmodernism is very difficult to describe, but essentially what it grew out of was Marxism. The original idea in Marxism is that you have the bourgeoisie class, and they control society, and they, through manipulation of history, politics, religion, etc., have manipulated the proletariat to not be able to see that they're being oppressed. They toss them babbles, they do all kinds of stuff to prevent them from seeing what's really going on. And Marx kind of thought that this was a natural, scientific, objective thing that would happen. Early socialism was very much concerned with objectivity and realism. Eventually, though, what happened was kind of after fascism and after kind of communism started to fail, as an economic model, the Marxists decided that what they had to do was abandon a lot of the failing parts of Marxism. Because so long as Marxism defined itself as being a scientific, objective ideology, in all of its attempts to run an economy ended in a crash and burn disaster, then people could say, well, this is bullshit. Also, as Mussolini had noticed, people just don't care as much about economics as you might think. Nation, religion, race, culture, all these things matter a lot more to the individual than socioeconomic class does per se. So what they decided to do was they took the principle of Marxism, the idea that there is this governing class, there is these people in power who extrude this influence over society, and that they're able to basically control society both mentally and physically and make society act against their interests. And what they did was they mixed this with anti-realism, which is kind of something you had growing in the post-war era, and that's where we get the concept of cultural Marxism and postmodernism. Because kind of one of the most basic ideas of postmodernism is that there's no objective reality. Reality is not only what we perceive it to be, it's more specifically what those with power tell us it is. So if you look at any form of kind of postmodernism or cultural Marxism, what it focuses on is power dynamics, white privilege, the patriarchy, heteronormativity, etc. The idea being that reality only exists the way it does because the people in power are able to force their reality onto you. So male traits, so like somebody like me or maybe one of you might say, well, there's gender roles in society because of and you'd start listing off the biological, hormonal, psychological differences between men and women. And a postmodernist would say no, because science is a concept that was created by the patriarchy and is something that is enforced upon us. Because I remember one time in university, I was told that aerodynamics was something the patriarchy imposed on society so that they could demonstrate their power by making things phallic shaped. And a friend of mine was in a film class, and they taught that stabbing someone is called, or shooting someone is called invagination. So what it is males demonstrating their dominance over other males, by making them feminized, by creating a vagina, by stabbing them with a sword. I know it didn't really make sense to me, but I kind of get what they're going for. So it's like if you talk to these people and you're like, well, what are your plans once you take power? And they just say, we just have to take power. Because to a certain extent, what they believe is if they took power and they overthrew the patriarchy, they could change reality. They could make it so men could have babies without surgeries. They could make it so women have penises. They could make it so that people don't die anymore. They just believe that the physical world is dependent upon whoever's in power. And all concepts of morality or things like that is just something that radiates from those in power, and that there's no objective world outside of it. So what did this rant have to do with 1984? Well, that is the party's philosophy. The party says, look, we have power for its own sake. There is no objective reality outside of the party. We can change history. We can change the world. And they don't just mean this metaphorically. They literally believe that they can change the past, as in like time traveling back in time and changing it. They believe that they can change the future. They believe all that matters is what they force upon the public. So when you hold to that view, there is no objective standards, because everything is just the subjectivity that is forced upon you by someone else's mind, or from a society's mind. So I think Orwell really accurately predicted that when he was making 1984, and he was talking about things like Newspeak and New Think and those sorts of things. He was kind of really accurately predicting postmodernism. So the party's philosophy is basically that all that needs to happen is the party needs to be in charge, and then poverty will just not be poverty, because they can redefine and they can just change reality through their power and through their ability to enforce their narrative on other people. So everything about them is designed not so much to perpetrate an ideology, but to keep them in power longer. Big Brother exists not out of any ideological conviction, but because people find it easier to relate to another person. So even though Big Brother is very obviously not a real person and is just a personification of the party and the state, people find that easier to relate to. So he just exists for that purpose. War is a good way to justify emergency powers and having a crisis. It's also a good way to unite the country and make them willing to make sacrifices. This helps the power of the government, so they pursue an eternal war. Probably the thing that's explored the most in 1984, though, is the idea that the middle class needs to be repressed. Because in Oceania, you have three classes. You have the proles, which are 85% of the population, the outer party that's about 12 to 15%, and the inner party that's less than 2%. So the outer party is the middle class. They're the ones who run the bureaucracies. They're the scientists, the engineers, etc. And they're the ones that are the heaviest, or the ones that face most of the repression. The inner party doesn't really care about repressing the proles, because they view the proles as just being plebs. Well, proles, plebs. That they don't have the capacity for revolution. Because if you look at history, pretty much all revolutions come from the middle class. Because the middle class has the ability to dream, they just don't have power. So you have in the middle class a group of people that's larger than the upper class and has the education and intelligence to be able to organize themselves and to come up with ideologies and to come up with informed movements, etc., but they don't have power. So what generally happens in history is most revolutions come from the middle class. French Revolution came from lawyers, the bourgeoisie, etc. A communist revolution in Russia also came from that. If you look at most revolutionaries, you have Castro was a lawyer, Che Guevara was I think he was it a dentist he was? But if you go through it, very few revolutionaries are actually poor. Most of them are middle or upper middle class. Because the upper class has no interest in revolution because they're the upper class. They're pretty happy with where they are. And the lower class is generally too concerned with eating and basic life. They don't really have the time or knowledge to launch a revolution. So all of the oppression in Oceanian society is targeted at the outer party. They're the ones who have to be the most openly patriotic. They're watched 24/7 with the video screens. They aren't allowed to have sex outside of procreative purposes in marriage. They live incredibly repressed lives. In general, the proles probably live a lot better than they do because the proles are poorer, but there's very little repression against the proles because they just don't really care about them. But the idea is if they can permanently repress the middle class, then Ing-Soc will continue on forever. So the party kind of combines a bunch of things together. They combine rewriting history, just promoting very crass nationalism, buying off the proles with pornography, alcohol, drugs, that kind of stuff, repressing the middle class, and trying to maintain extremely tight discipline among the upper class. And they kind of think by combining all of this stuff, they will create an all-powerful state that will kind of radiate the power to change reality. So what a lot of people tend to see is they look at 1984 and they're terrified. And they go, oh my God, this is inevitably going to happen. And this is the perfect dictatorship. This is going to last forever. There's nothing we can do once this comes about. Fear not, gentle listener. There's lots of reasons why the world of 1984 would not last. And we're going to talk about what I'd call a hard break and a lot of soft breaks. So the hard break is the point at which eventually this world is inevitably going to collapse regardless of what else happens. Now, why is this? Because to have a totalitarian society, you have to have a centrally planned economy. Once you start to have a market economy, it's a lot harder to maintain the same levels of control. You can have an authoritarian government with capitalism, but once you have capitalism, you're going to have inequality, you're going to have some form of meritocracy, you're going to have aspects of society that aren't going to be directly overseen by the government in just order for it to function. So if you're going to have a totalitarian society, you have to have a planned economy. Even countries that didn't exactly have planned economies, like Germany, were very close to having planned economies. And generally speaking, the more totalitarian a society gets, the more planned the economy goes. Because in a lot of fascist states, which weren't like that totalitarian, they still had a capitalist economy or kind of a mixed economy. But once you get into the communist states and Nazi Germany, you start to get countries that are almost entirely command-based. I'm not exactly sure how the economy works in Islamic states, but even then, in the Arab countries that have undergone the oil revolution, it is becoming harder and harder to maintain totalitarian religious standards. In countries like the UAE, they've largely given up on it, for tourists at least, because the need to market to the lowest common denominator kind of precludes utopian projects for good and ill. So the point is that all three states in this have to have planned economies. It's just a given. Now, why is that a hard break? Because planned economies don't work. They never have worked. They never will work unless maybe we get a supercomputer to run it. But they don't have a supercomputer in 1984. And I have my doubts as to how effective one could be at running the economy. And they don't work because they're ridiculous. So like what they would have in the Soviet Union is they'd have some bureaucrat in Moscow who would be like, I think we need 25 million pounds of nails this year. So then he'd send the order out to the factories to make 25 million tons of nails. So then the factory owners would be like, okay, or not factory owners, but factory managers would be like, okay, we need this amount of metal. And then they go to the metal bureaucrat and they'd be like, okay, can you assign us this much metal? And then the metal bureaucrat would be like, no, because the mining bureaucrat said we can only generate this much metal a year, and we only have allocated this much metal to you to make this many nails. And then they'll be like, well, then we won't have enough nails to do building and like you can just look at this, like just this chain. And then there's also, and this one's fairly straightforward, I guess. It's kind of a bit too simple because if you have to make a certain number of nails, you can probably predict the amount of iron you need. But let's say when they're trying to determine how many nails they need, they might do something like, okay, we have this many buildings in the Soviet Union. Maybe this many will be built. We'll order this many nails. And like you just get into all these assumptions, and you often have people who aren't really qualified or don't have any knowledge of this. And then you have to get all this stuff together. You have to get all these people to count all the buildings and then estimate how many nails are in each building. And then like it's just crazy. And it just doesn't work. And even though some centrally planned societies can temporarily achieve economic growth and development, eventually just the extreme inefficiencies of it catch up with them. Because like North Korea at one point had a pretty strong industrialized economy. For a while it was wealthier than South Korea. But because of central planning, another thing central planning does is it decentivizes work. Because there's no point in working because you get paid the same no matter what. It decentivizes work, it decentivizes efficiency, distribution of resources. It decentivizes increasing production. And it generally speaking, in almost all cases, leads to the industry that's built early on running down. Like by the end of the Soviet Union, stuff was just falling apart. By the end of North Korea, well, North Korea is not over, but stuff was falling apart. Stuff was falling apart in China. These societies just don't really last very long. And this happens in a matter of decades. It's described in 1984 that pretty much everything's falling apart, and the party's only been in power for like 30 years. Like people just live in like rundown apartments. There's garbage everywhere. Nothing is really working. And I'm sure given another decade or two in the 1984 universe, electricity is going to start breaking down. The factories that make the view screens are going to start breaking down. And as the state starts to disintegrate, it's going to become very hard to maintain centralized control to the degree they have. Because their centralized control relies on all sorts of things that modern technology requires that can largely only be produced en masse in a industrialized capitalist society. I recall a story about when they used to try to show documentaries on poverty in America and Russia, and the Russian people would like riot when they saw it because like these people have shoes, and we take that for granted that everybody in society has shoes, but in Oceania I think it's only like 50% of the population doesn't have shoes. So it just can't last forever. Eventually that's going to happen. Eventually there's going to be widespread famines. Eventually just everything's going to fall apart. So that's the hard stop. Their society will disintegrate, as all centrally planned societies eventually do. And North Korea's made a pretty good go of it, but you have a society in which soon a majority of the population will be deformed from the degree of malnourishment that they've been put through. I mean, just think about that for a minute. So these societies can keep going for quite a while, but eventually, like I said, there is going to be that hard break. Now, there's also some soft breaks. The first being that it's very hard to maintain the level of discipline among the upper class for a prolonged period of time. Eventually, what tends to happen is you'll have a man of immense talents, or at least immense brutality, your Stalins, your Mao Zedongs, your Hitlers, your Castros, and they're able to keep the system going. But once they die, and there's not necessarily a clear leader, then it's difficult to have someone to keep the system going. And I guess in 1984, the idea is there isn't a leader, the party itself is the leader. But the issue still applies. Okay, there's going to be turnover. The people who run the party aren't immortal. So as you have turnover, you're going to have different people coming in with different ideas, no matter how much they try to implement thought control. It's not, you're not going to have uniformity at the top. I mean, Russia and China were both totalitarian states, and you had Khrushchev and Deng Xiaoping who came in. Deng Xiaoping had extremely different ideas for how to run China, and Khrushchev had very different ideas on how to run the Soviet Union. Both came out of an oligarchical party, and both of them succeeded two of the most extreme totalitarian periods in human history. And yet, once they gained power, they were able to change things a lot. The Soviet Union and China had virtually limitless ability to socially engineer, and in the end, both systems collapsed. I understand the Communist Party is still in power in China, but they had to abandon central planning and switch to a market economy. They also kind of abandoned most of the revolutionary talk, and they're just kind of a nationalist country now. The Chinese ideology, if anything, China is kind of more of a fascist state now than a communist state. But my point is, it's very hard to maintain that level of discipline at the top. You also have to maintain a certain level of self-delusion and self-denial. Because what if the upper class, over time, believes all their own propaganda? It's like, we can win this war. And they kind of lose track of the idea that the war is just there to burn off excess production, and they actually try to win the war, and maybe one side does win the war. I mean, if it's possible, maybe one side collapses sooner than the other two do. Maybe that they start to actually pursue new technologies, and that gives them an edge. So you have to have like a certain degree of cynicism indefinitely on the upper class. I just don't know if that's possible. I don't know if that really fits in with people's identities to be that cynical. At least to have that larger group of people who are that cynical. People normally on some level want to think of themselves as being a good person. They need something to feel good about themselves. Even if it's bullshit, even if it's obviously a rationalization, I think it's a core aspect of human nature. And as I said, I think either what you'll have happen in the upper party is you'll have people who will lose track of the idea that power exists for power's own sake, and start to believe that power is to be used for the betterment of the nation, or something like that. So we have that aspect of it, which I think is important. You also have whether or not you can realistically keep track of the middle class indefinitely. Because once again, you have the same basic issue: is what if the head of the secret police decides that they don't like the current system and they want to change things? What if somebody who has control over the army or something stages a coup because they want authority all for themselves? And what if the middle class, regardless, organizes? Because they can't watch everybody all the time. And what often will happen in these systems is it's very hard to maintain this level of intensity. There's only so much people can take. Like, people snap. Like, if everybody's constantly on edge 24/7, and the people who run this system are just as much on edge as the plebs are, then they're eventually going to either snap or just start laying off. And that's kind of what starts happening in a lot of communist states, is they kind of abandon applying secret policing in an ideological way, and they just switch over to using their powers arbitrarily for bribes. So maybe the secret police in 2019, 1984, we'll just kind of give up on the whole totalitarianism thing and be like, okay, we tried it, it failed. Instead, we're going to just stop, be a bit more laid back. It's very hard to keep the country on a war economy forever. With regards to the proles, eventually they will riot. Because, as I said, eventually a centrally planned economy doesn't work, it doesn't feed the public. Once they stop getting food, and they will stop getting food, they will riot and they will kill the upper class. I mean, that's just a given. And the government doesn't seem to have any way of preventing that. So that's just fundamentally the issue is, regardless of what the party thinks it can do, it can't change human nature. It can't stop death. It can't stop the issue of turnover, the issue of maintaining extreme circumstances on people indefinitely. You just can't do that. So, well, I think the purpose is not necessarily to to state that as the likely possibility. I think that it is kind of more of a warning and kind of more of an examination of the ideology. So I know I just kind of talked about a whole bunch of different shit in this. There's so much to say about 1984. I could probably sit here for another 4 hours and not get through half of it. But those were just kind of some of the major points I wanted to talk about. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you guys later.